I mean, I was nearly beaten to death as a kid. If you want to call that bullying, then fine. But let's be clear, it went far beyond what most people think of when they hear that word. This wasn't about mean nicknames or being excluded from games. It was violence. Brutal, relentless violence. There's one incident that still haunts me. A group of boys decided I was their target that day. It wasn't random, they had it out for me for reasons I couldn't understand. They shoved me down a flight of stairs, my body tumbling and slamming against the hard steps. Before I could even gather myself, they were on top of me. They pinned me down. And then the punches started, fist after fist, blow after blow. They didn't stop. Not when I cried out. Not when I begged. Not even when I stopped resisting because I couldn't move anymore. I remember lying there, unable to catch my breath, the world spinning around me. The pain was overwhelming. But worse than that was the sheer helplessness. I thought they might actually kill me. And the terrifying part is that I think they came close. It wasn't just my body that was bruised that day, it was my spirit. That was the kind of bullying I dealt with. It wasn't childish pranks or playground scuffles. It was life-threatening, and it left scars that went far deeper than the physical ones. When I think about my childhood, the word safe never really comes to mind. I didn't feel safe at school, clearly. With attacks like that, how could I? But it wasn't just the schoolyard. There was no refuge, no place where I felt protected. At home, at school, even just walking around the neighborhood, there was this constant undercurrent of fear. It was like the world was against me. Like I didn't belong anywhere. When you're a kid, you're not equipped to deal with that kind of thing. You don't have the tools to process it, to rationalize it. All you can do is endure. You wake up every day knowing you'll face the same horrors. But you push through anyway because what other choice do you have? You just exist, trying to survive long enough for things to get better, hoping they'll get better. That's what those years were for me. Not childhood, not innocence, not fun, survival. But childhood wasn't just hard because of the external stuff, the constant moving, being the smallest in the class, or struggling to fit in. It was hard because of me. I was different, and not in a way that felt like it made me special or interesting. By the time I was 5 or 6, I knew something about me wasn't like the other kids. My mind, it worked in ways I couldn't explain, even to myself. It was like being tuned into a completely different frequency, one that nobody else seemed to hear. I remember sitting on the edge of the playground, watching the other kids as they ran around, laughing and playing, talking about things that seemed so simple, so easy for them. They were fully in their world, and they belonged to it in a way I just didn't. They seemed so normal, so at ease with each other. And then there was me off to the side, lost in my own little universe, thinking about things no one else seemed to care about. I wasn't just playing pretend or daydreaming about superheroes like most kids my age. I was wondering about the stars, about how machines worked, about why we exist at all. My thoughts felt so big, too big, and sometimes they scared me. My head was like this constant storm, an endless explosion of ideas, questions, and possibilities. It wasn't bad. Exactly. It was exciting, exhilarating even, but it was also relentless. Imagine trying to sleep with fireworks going off in your head, or trying to listen to a teacher talk about math when your brain is busy reimagining how the universe might work. That's what it was like. I'd sit there, staring at the chalkboard, but my mind would already be a million miles away, solving problems no one had asked me to solve, imagining inventions no one had asked me to build, and questioning everything. Why things were the way they were, why people acted the way they did, why the world wasn't different. And then, slowly, I started to notice something. The other kids weren't like that. They weren't buzzing with thoughts they couldn't contain. They weren't obsessed with the same strange questions that kept me up at night. They seemed so settled, so comfortable in their own heads. It wasn't just that I was different, it was that I was too different. And for a while, that difference felt like a flaw, like a problem that needed fixing. I'd wonder, what's wrong with me? Why couldn't I just be like them? Why couldn't I turn my brain off for a second and just be? It was lonely, being trapped in this whirlwind of thoughts that no one else seemed to understand. And it was isolating to realize that the things that fascinated me didn't matter to the people around me. They weren't bad people, of course not. They were just normal kids, doing normal kid things. But I wasn't like them, and I couldn't make myself be. Looking back now, I can see that difference for what it really was, a gift. But at the time, it felt like a curse. Because being different isn't always easy, especially when you're a kid and all you want is to belong. When you're young, the world doesn't celebrate what sets you apart. It just makes you feel like you don't fit. And for a long time, I thought that's all I'd ever be, the kid who didn't belong, the one who was always stuck in his own head. trying to make sense of a world that didn't make sense to him. I genuinely believed I might be insane. I mean, what kind of 5 or 6-year-old even has thoughts like that? But there I was, a little kid with a mind that never stopped racing, feeling completely alien in my own skin. I'd already decided definitively that I couldn't let anyone know how my brain worked. The stakes felt impossibly high. I was convinced that if anyone found out what was going on in my head, they'd take me away, lock me up in some cold, sterile place where strange kids go. I didn't fully understand what being institutionalized meant, but I knew it was bad, and I was terrified of it. This wasn't a fleeting worry. It was a constant shadow, a persistent fear that burrowed deep into my young mind. Imagine being a child and feeling like you're harboring a secret so huge, so incomprehensible, that even your parents couldn't be trusted with it. That's how it felt. I couldn't tell them. I couldn't tell my teachers. I couldn't tell anyone. Instead, I carried it around with me like a weight pressing down on my chest, day after day, year after year. I tried to act normal, whatever that meant, but it always felt like a losing game. No matter how hard I worked to blend in, to seem like everyone else, there was this part of me that couldn't help but stick out. It wasn't just the thoughts themselves, though they were a big part of it. It was how fast they came, how deeply they burrowed, how different they felt from what I imagined other kids were thinking about. My mind was always spinning, questioning, building, deconstructing things that, even at that young age, I knew other people wouldn't understand. And people don't like what they don't understand. They fear it. They ridicule it. Even as a little kid, I'd already figured that out. I'd seen how different kids who didn't fit the mold, got treated. They were teased, ostracized, pushed to the edges of the group, sometimes even by adults who were supposed to protect them. The thought of becoming one of those kids was unbearable. So, I learned to keep my mouth shut, to smile and nod when necessary, to act like I was on the same wavelength as everyone else, even when I wasn't. But it was exhausting. Pretending to be something you're not always is. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't fully suppress the parts of me that felt alien. I couldn't stop asking questions no one else seemed to think about. I couldn't stop being curious about things that other kids found boring or weird. I couldn't stop being me, even though being me felt like a liability. So, I walked this tightrope between hiding and existing, trying to figure out where I fit in a world that didn't seem designed for people like me. What made it harder was that I didn't even have the language to explain what I was feeling. I just knew that I was different, that my mind worked in ways that made other people uncomfortable, and that I couldn't risk letting them see it. I became an expert at masking, at deflecting, at giving just enough of myself to avoid suspicion without ever revealing too much. But it was lonely. God, it was lonely. Even in a crowded classroom or at a family gathering, I felt like I was on the outside looking in, like everyone else was part of some grand inside joke that I didn't get. I'd watch them laugh and talk and wonder if I was missing something fundamental, some crucial piece of the puzzle that would make everything click. But deep down, I knew the truth. The puzzle wasn't broken. It was just mine, and no one else had the pieces to understand it. So, I retreated inward. I built a world inside my head, one where I didn't have to worry about being too strange or too different. It wasn't ideal, but it was safe. And at the time, safety felt like the most important thing in the world. Looking back, I can see how much that isolation shaped me, how it pushed me to explore the depths of my own mind in ways I might not have otherwise. But in the moment, it just felt like survival, like keeping a secret so big it could swallow me whole. And in a way, I wasn't wrong. If I'd opened up back then, if I'd shared too much too soon, who knows how people would have reacted? Maybe they would have understood. Or maybe they would have confirmed my worst fears and proved that I really was too strange to belong. Either way, it felt like a risk I couldn't afford to take. So, I kept my thoughts to myself and prayed. Even that someday, it would all make sense. That someday, I'd figure out how to live in a world that didn't seem built for someone like me. I was already a loner, and the constant moving only made it worse. In just a few years, I went through 6 different schools. Each time I began to settle in, to learn the rhythms of a new place, it would all get upended. We'd pack up and head somewhere else, and I'd have to start over again. There's something uniquely exhausting about being the perpetual outsider, the kid who walks into a classroom full of strangers, trying to figure out the unspoken rules all over again. It's like being trapped in a cycle where you're always on the edge of belonging but never quite make it. Most of the time, I didn't even try to make friends. What was the point when I knew it wouldn't last? I became used to eating lunch alone, sitting quietly at the back of the room, and fading into the background. It's hard to explain how isolating that feels. especially as a kid. When you're young, you crave stability, connection, and the comfort of familiar faces. I didn't have that, and it left this persistent feeling of displacement, like I didn't belong anywhere. And if being the new kid wasn't enough of a challenge, I was also the youngest in my class most of the time. My mom, noticing my need for more intellectual stimulation, sent me to school early. Academically, it might have been the right decision, but socially, it set me back even further. I was smaller than the other kids, quieter, and more awkward. It made me an easy target. I can still remember the cruel nicknames, the way they would tease me for being different. Kids can be relentless, and when you're the quiet, new kid who doesn't fight back, you might as well have a bullseye on your back. But my differences went beyond being the youngest or the smallest. I didn't think the way other kids did. My mind was always racing, brimming with questions and ideas, things I wanted to explore and understand. I saw the world differently, and I acted differently, too. While the other kids were chasing each other on the playground or talking about sports, I was off in my own head, thinking about how things worked or imagining what could be. For a long time, I didn't want anyone to know how different I was. I was scared. What if they thought I was crazy? What if they laughed at me even more? So I stayed quiet, kept my head down, and tried to blend in as best I could. But even when I managed to avoid the teasing, the loneliness didn't go away. It followed me everywhere. This persistent feeling that I didn't fit in, that I didn't belong, not with my classmates, not even in the places I called home for those fleeting moments. Books became my refuge. They were my escape from the constant upheaval, the teasing, and the feeling of being out of place. In the pages of a book, I could lose myself in worlds where anything was possible. Stories, science, philosophy, they became my companions. My way of making sense of a world that often felt indifferent. When everything else was in flux, books were my constant. Looking back, I think those experiences of isolation and being different shaped me in ways I didn't realize at the time. They forced me to rely on myself, to find comfort in my own company, and to embrace the parts of me that didn't fit into the mold. It was painful, sure, but it also taught me resilience. And while I didn't see it then, being different wasn't a weakness, it was the foundation of everything I'd eventually become. Isolation, for me, turned out to be a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was deeply lonely. There were days when it felt like I didn't belong anywhere. I didn't have close friends to share my thoughts with, no one to confide in about my dreams or fears. That kind of loneliness can weigh heavily on a child. But on the other hand, that same solitude gave me something invaluable, the freedom to think. It gave me the mental space to explore ideas without fear of judgment or rejection, to follow my curiosity wherever it led. Without the distraction of a social circle, I immersed myself in learning, building, and creating. It wasn't some deliberate effort to be extraordinary. At the time, I was just trying to survive in a world that often felt unwelcoming and confusing. But in hindsight, that survival instinct channeled into curiosity and creativity laid the foundation for everything I would later achieve. From as early as I can remember, I've been fascinated by the world. As a kid, I read voraciously anything I could get my hands on. By the time I was 9 or 10, I had exhausted every book within reach. I remember the frustration of running out of material to read. In desperation, I turned to the encyclopedia. It wasn't exactly thrilling reading, but it was something. Page by page, I devoured it, not realizing at the time that I was building an unintentional treasure trove of knowledge. Reading wasn't just a hobby for me, it was a necessity. It wasn't only about learning facts or acquiring skills, it was about feeding an insatiable hunger to understand the world. Each book, each page, was a new piece of the puzzle, a small step toward answering the endless questions swirling in my mind. When I was a kid, I didn't dream of changing the world. Honestly, I just loved video games. I played them obsessively, often losing myself for hours in their imaginative worlds. It was only later that I realized I could go from being a player to being a creator. If I learned to program, I could build my own games. That realization was a game changer for me, literally and figuratively. At first, it was a purely practical motivation. I wanted to make enough money selling software to buy better computers. It wasn't about pursuing some lofty vision or trying to innovate. But what started as a practical step evolved into something far more significant. I discovered that the skills I learned to create games could be applied to so many other areas. I think a lot of people underestimate what they're capable of. They assume that certain skills are beyond their reach, that some doors are permanently closed. But the truth is, most doors can be opened if you're willing to learn. If you read, ask questions, and talk to the right people, you can achieve almost anything. There's a popular misconception that my father inspired my interest in technology. That's not true. My dad was an engineer, but he wasn't much of a technologist. In fact, he was quite skeptical about computers and their potential. When I first expressed interest in getting a computer, he flat out refused. He didn't believe they would amount to anything. So, I saved up my allowance, bit by bit, until I could afford one myself. Only after I had almost enough money did he reluctantly chip in the rest. It's ironic, considering how integral computers have been to my life and work. But while he didn't share my enthusiasm for technology, he did expose me to technical concepts through his work as an electrical and mechanical engineer. That exposure, combined with my own curiosity, set me on the path I eventually followed. My mom often says I was different from a very young age. She tells stories about how, even as a toddler, I reasoned with her in ways that most 3-year-olds couldn't. By the time I started school, it was clear I needed more stimulation than the standard curriculum offered. I was often the youngest in my class, and while that added to my sense of isolation, it also fueled my determination. I didn't just want to learn for the sake of learning. I wanted to apply what I was learning in ways that mattered, whether it was solving a problem, building something new, or exploring an idea. I wanted my efforts to have a tangible impact. I still remember the day I first read about ion engines in an encyclopedia. I was in elementary school, and the concept fascinated me. At the time, it seemed like science fiction, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Today, ion engines are a reality, and we're using them to launch satellites into space. It's amazing to see how those seeds of curiosity planted in my childhood have grown into something far bigger. My goal has always been to do useful things that maximize the probability of a good future. Whether it's Tesla, SpaceX, or any of the other projects I've been involved in, the idea has always been to create something meaningful. It's about making the world better, more exciting, and more worth looking forward to. At Tesla, for example, we don't just aim to make electric cars. We aim to make cars that people love. How many things can you buy that truly bring you joy? It's rare, but it's worth striving for. Ultimately, I want to build a future that people are excited about, a future filled with innovation, possibility, and hope. Because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. Creating a world where extraordinary things are possible for everyone.